This is Arab Talk on KPOO, 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Khannan.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, we're 50 days plus into the ethnic cleansing and genocide that's occurring in Gaza right now. There are close to 15,000 Palestinians that have been killed, and recent estimates suggest that 10,000 of the killed are women and children. Right now, we're in the third day of the pause, and as we speak right now, there's the next release of hostages coming from Hamas, as well as a release of Palestinian political prisoners that have been imprisoned in Palestine for decades. The Palestinians that are being released, Jamal, are women and children that have been in Palestinian and Israeli jails, in some cases for decades. There are 1.7 million internally displaced Palestinians right now. Some Palestinians during the pause who tried to go back to their homes in the north to just check on loved ones were shot at and killed. The situation in Gaza right now is absolutely grave, despite the fact that there are convoys of food, water, and medicine coming into Gaza. It's not reaching the north, where the situation is absolutely cataclysmic. We're going to be talking about all those things, including the exchange of hostages, the mounting evidence that Israeli soldiers themselves killed their own citizens and have covered it up. We're going to talk about global pro-Palestinian demonstrations that are growing all over the world. And of course, Jamal, one of my favorite topics is Stuart Selwitz, a former Obama national security advisor who has been arrested and released on basically hate crime. But before we get to that, we're going to watch a really great interview that you did with Montreal-based activist and author Yves Engler. Talks about how Heather Reisman and her billionaire husband, Gary Schwartz, established and are directors of the registered Canadian charity called HESEG, HESEG Foundation for Lone Soldiers. Now check this out, Jamal, it's crazy. Lone soldiers are not Israelis that HESEG encourages and supports joining the IDF in order to suppress Palestinians and man checkpoints in the occupied West Bank. It is absolutely crazy. This is an eye-opening interview that you did.
It's absolutely crazy because, of course, our guest is from Canada, and he talks about their work in Canada. But they're actually all over. They do it in the United States, they do it in Europe. They basically fund, the husband, Mr. Schwartz, is a billionaire, so has a lot of money, and they fund and recruit lone soldiers. And that's why you hear sometimes, what is a lone soldier? And they just send them there, basically enlist them in the Israeli military. Most likely they'll be sent to man checkpoints to harass Palestinians in the West Bank. And of course, when you have a conflict like this, some of them die or taken hostage, and they are citizens of another state. So, for example, maybe one of those soldiers is Canadian that now Canada wants to have to see free, or an American soldier and whatever. But the big story about this is not just doing this, and that's what Yves spoke about, is they raise money in Canada, and it is tax deductible as a charity, and it's tax deductible. And we know the history about minor things, not even close to these things that happened in the United States, like with the Holy Land Foundation and others, where people sent contributions to Gaza and they got into a lot of trouble. But these guys, not only they're taking money and sending contributions and recruiting soldiers to fight in another country, they are also getting a tax credit. So let's watch Yves Engler. In the pre-dawn hours, Toronto police burst through the doors of several homes, often without properly identifying themselves. They handcuffed all residents, several of them elderly, and confiscated laptops and all other electronic devices. The large-scale operation was in response to political posters and fake blood spread on the storefront of an Indigo bookstore. On the posters were photos of Indigo's high-profile CEO, Heather Reisman, stamped with the statement, "Funding Genocide." Heather Reisman and her billionaire husband, Gary Schwartz, established and are directors of the registered Canadian charity, the HESEG Foundation for Lone Soldiers, an organization that funds and encourages young Canadians and elsewhere to enlist in the Israeli military. In his piece, Toronto Police Arrest Palestine Activists Should Target Heather Reisman, Yves Engler notes that HESEG may be violating Canada's Foreign Enlistment Act, charges far more serious than poster hanging. So why hasn't Reisman been apprehended? Joining us on Arab Talk is Yves Engler. He is a Montreal-based activist and author who has published 12 books, including his latest, Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. Welcome to Arab Talk, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
So it's really scary stuff having one's door broken in, being handcuffed and charged with hate crimes for just hanging social justice messages. This was not a violent crime, yet the police allocated a lot of manpower to indiscriminately round up individuals and seize property. You call these thought crimes. Talk about the increase in criminalization and repression of those criticizing Israel in Canada and internationally.
Yeah, what happened in Toronto is a very egregious example of arresting, detaining a whole bunch of people for posters. I mean, really, all we're talking about is posters, and this was all taken down from the storefront pretty quickly. There was fake blood, but it was water-soluble paint that can be washed off. This is maybe the most egregious example. There's another in Calgary. There was a activist who chanted from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And he was detained, and they initially implied that they were going to put hate charge against him for this chant, which is, of course, again, a social justice chant about liberty. That they ultimately, Calgary police have now subsequently dropped the charge. But there is just example after example of people who've been fired. An Air Canada pilot was fired for posting messages, going to a Palestine solidarity demonstration, posting messages on Instagram. You have University of Alberta, a sexual assault center person who was fired. You have a chaplain at the University of Western Ontario, London, Ontario, fired. There are just example after example of people opposing genocide, people who are standing for what's right and against war crimes being targeted. And the idea that putting up posters on an Indigo bookstore, and it should be clear that this Indigo bookstore, there's been a boycott of Indigo for more than a decade. I published a book in 2010, Canada and Israel Building Apartheid in 2010, and I actually asked the publisher not to sell it through the Indigo bookstore, which is the biggest bookstore chain in Canada, where the posters were put of Heather Reisman, because Heather Reisman and her husband have set up this HESEG Foundation, which is basically a subsidy for the Israeli military, and specifically a subsidy for non-Israelis to join the Israeli murder force. And it's a way, and it should be important. It's also a way to pressure Israelis who are a little bit uncomfortable about the action of the IDF, and it's a way to say, hey, people coming from Vancouver, from Toronto, from New York, from Paris, who are going out of their way to join, and you as an Israeli, you should be happy to join the military force. So it has this sort of political effect inside of Israel that's, I think, very negative, and that's why you have a whole bunch of former IDF generals on the board of the HESEG Foundation.
Well, is that
putting out posters?
Sorry, but I just wanted to clarify. Isn't this what the HESEG Foundation is doing violates not only Canadian Revenue Agency laws, but Canada's Foreign Enlistment Act?
Yeah, well, so it's very clear. Canada Revenue Agency rules are absolutely crystal clear that it's charitable to support the Canadian military. It is not charitable to support foreign militaries. So it doesn't matter what, not just about Israel's crimes, Israeli military crimes, but it's just a fact we do not provide tax subsidies for Canadians to donate to other countries' militaries. So in that sense, the HESEG Foundation should have lost its charitable status a long time ago. And it's not the only one. Unfortunately, it's not the only registered charity that's supporting the IDF. And we've been campaigning on this issue in the last couple of years where we look like they're having some headway with the Canada Revenue Agency. But so that's crystal clear. It should lose its charitable status. And the $100 million, literally $100 million that Reisman and Schwartz have given to this HESEG Foundation that they set up, this charity they set up, they probably received about $40 million in tax credits from the Canadian taxpayer for these donations to support non-Israelis to join the IDF. But that's crystal clear. Now, the Foreign Enlistment Act says that it's contrary to Canadian law to induce Canadians to join another country's military. And you can make a pretty strong case that the HESEG Foundation is inducing Canadians to join the IDF, because basically what they're doing is they're saying if these non-Israelis join the Israeli military, we will provide you all these bursaries and scholarships so you have free education. And now there's other things, other forms of support as well, but primarily it's about free education, giving a whole bunch of money to non-Israelis to go to university after joining the Israeli military. So they are offering, I think there's a good legal case to be made, an inducement for Canadians to join a foreign military, in which case they would be violating the Foreign Enlistment Act. Now that crime is far, far more significant than the potential of vandalism. And I'm not even sure it is vandalism, because there's a whole legal question about whether if you can remove something, whether it actually is vandalism on a storefront to put up a poster that can be removed fairly easily. But let's just say that the people that the Toronto police have arrested in the middle of the night, that they may have been engaged in vandalism. Violating the Foreign Enlistment Act is clearly a bigger criminal offense than vandalism. That's to leave aside the bigger moral question of the fact that the Israeli military is committing genocide in Gaza. 15,000 plus people have been killed. 6,000 plus children have been killed. An effort to really ethnically cleanse, and that the Reisman is supporting that and underwriting that financially, and in fact getting the Canadian taxpayer to underwrite that financially. That, of course, on a moral level, is a far greater a moral outrage than people who, in fact, are doing something that was very good, which is raising awareness of the genocide in Gaza, and specifically raising awareness of the fact that this bookstore and the CEO of this bookstore is complicit in those war crimes.
So how are they circumventing and violating laws to prevent this siphoning of Canadian resources to a foreign entity?
Well, in 2020, Just Peace Advocates, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Palestinians and Jews United, we launched a campaign that was a letter that was signed by the people like Noam Chomsky, Roger Waters, a whole bunch of high-profile international and Canadian figures, calling on Canadian government authorities to enforce the Foreign Enlistment Act, because about 100, it varies every year, but about 100 Canadians are recruited into the Israeli military. There's also other programs there's a whole volunteer program of just working on Israeli military bases as well. So there's a series of other forms, but about 100 Canadians are recruited every year, mostly young men. And the Israeli consulate has been openly recruiting Canadians. The federations, the Jewish federations here in Montreal, have promoted events that are basically designed to recruit Canadians to join the Israeli military. There's in fact a whole bunch of schools, high schools, that they organize these IDF days, and they bring in former or current Israeli soldiers to talk about the great things of the IDF. And there's a good case to be made. Even these schools are inducing teenage Canadians to try to join the IDF. Now, we launched this public letter. We got actually Le Devoir, a daily newspaper in Montreal, to actually publish it on the front page. And the next day, the reporter from Le Devoir asked the then Justice Minister, David Lametti, about the matter. And David Lametti, about enforcing the Foreign Enlistment Act around Israel, David Lametti just punted it aside and said, this is nothing to do with us. This is a policing matter. So then it got pushed over to the police. And then we started sending emails to the police. We actually action alert campaigns to the police. And the police just basically dragged their feet on it. Then we launched another legal thing around this group, Sarel, which organizes Canadians to volunteer on Israeli military bases usually for 3 weeks to do non-combat work on Israeli bases, but which includes preparing guns and stuff like that. And we launched this legal battle, and we got a judge to agree to, because the police wouldn't deal with it. The police just ignored it. We got a judge to agree to hear the case. And then the Crown stepped in and just dismissed it. So basically, government officials just stepped in and were able to just dismiss it. The legal process is still playing itself out, and there's still a small possibility that it will be heard. But the basic gist is that the political structure, the policing structure in the country, absolutely don't want to touch this, and I think the campaign that we've done has led to a little bit less open public recruitment for the Israeli military, but in effect, legally speaking, they can operate in without being pursued criminally.
Sheltering aid to Israel's military inside a charity is not a new tactic in Canada. The Jewish National Fund recently had a formal complaint filed against it for funding multiple projects that directly benefited Israel's military, something again prohibited by Canada Revenue Agency. The outcome has not yet been released. Does this show how big of an appetite Israel's military has and how increasingly problematic it is to sustain it?
Well, I think what the Jewish National Fund, that's a campaign around that goes back a few years. And that was a multifaceted targeting of their charitable status, one element being their support for the Israeli military. And the Canada Revenue Agency basically did say that the JNF was contravening Canadian charity rules, and essentially just should have rescinded their charitable status, but instead just put these conditions on the JNF that are relevant. They're good. They make it harder for the JNF to support the IDF and to be openly racist, but didn't go as far as the revenue agency should have gone. Now there's all these charities that support Israeli universities in Canada, that like the Technion has a whole slew of relationships to the Israeli military. And there's a couple hundred Israel-focused charities in Canada that all get subsidies from the Canadian government to provide donations. And a whole bunch of them support the IDF to varying degrees of directness. But I think that kind of at a bigger picture level, Israel is a state. The U.S. is a pretty militarized country, but Israel is an even more militarized country, where pretty much every Israeli university is working directly with the IDF. A whole slew of different institutional structures are working with the IDF. And so when you have a situation like you do in Canada, where you have all these charities raising funds for Israel, and this is a completely unique thing, right? There's no other country. Israel has a GDP per capita equivalent to Canada's. And yet we're fundraising somewhere between $250 million and $500 million a year for projects in Israel. There is no equivalent to Japan. There's no equivalent to Sweden or France, right? There's not all these charities in Canada supporting museums and universities and guide dog societies like they are in Israel, and that's what's happening. And so within that, it's actually quite fascinating because there's Canada Revenue Agency rules are very clear on foreign militaries. There are also West Bank settlements contravene Canadian law, right? Ostensibly, supporting West Bank settlements should contravene Canada Revenue Agency rules. And also, the Canada Revenue Agency has a policy going back more than 2 decades saying that it tries to support anti-racism. So any organization that's explicitly racist, and a series of Canadian charities support explicitly racist organizations in Israel. So there's all these charities in Canada assisting projects in Israel that violate current Canada Revenue Agency rules, not like better laws that should oppose apartheid and should oppose all the war crimes committing, but current laws that current regulations within the Canada Revenue Agency, and they've been seen to have been willing to apply these laws to a certain extent, but for the most part, as the JNF case shows, when a charity is a powerful, in the case of JNF, Jewish National Fund Canada, it's probably the second most powerful Israel-focused charity. When it's powerful, the revenue agency, may be willing to sort of slap them on the wrist, but they're not willing to go to that next step of actually revoking the charitable status. And that just speaks to the sort of political culture in Canada, which is a decidedly pro-Zionist political culture, deeply, deeply anti-Palestinian. And that's been something that's been the way for a century or more.
I don't know about many of the cases in Canada, but I know, for example, in the United States, if you had Arab Americans or Muslim Americans, and we had several cases, if they made a donation, let's say, to a charitable organization in Gaza, many of them got in trouble and actually were either, if they weren't citizens, they were deported or they were put in jail. Do you have similar cases where Arab or Muslim Canadians have gotten in trouble for making contribution to Palestinians?
Yeah, when you contrast how charities that support the IDF, racist organizations are treated versus charities that support Palestinians, it makes it even more outrageous. And the preeminent case is the IRFAN, the International Relief Fund for the Afflicted and Needy, which is was a Toronto-based Muslim charity that supported a whole bunch of projects around the world. Specifically, they were supporting orphans in Gaza, and they supported a hospital in Gaza, and they sent a dialysis machine to a hospital in Gaza, and they were supporting, which went through the health authorities, and Hamas controls the political structure in Gaza, so the dialysis machine went through the proper political authority, and similarly, the donations to the orphans went through the post office, which does the banking, does in lots of places does banking, and same thing in Gaza, and that again was run under the Hamas authority, and they lost their charitable status for this, but it went beyond that. IRFAN became the first Canadian-based organization that was put on Canada's terrorist list, right? So a whole bunch of Palestinian organizations are on Canada's terrorist list, but they're not, Canadian-based. IRFAN was the first Canadian-based organization put on Canada's terrorist list for, again, supporting orphans and the hospital in Gaza. And so, you have this billionaire Toronto couple that has a foundation it's called the HESEG Foundation for Lone Soldiers. It's in the name of the charity that they're supporting non-Israelis to join the Israeli military. And they can, fundraise $100 million, get subsidies for $100 million in donations. And then you have a group supporting orphans and a hospital in Gaza. And they not only lose their charitable status, but they're actually put on the terrorist list.
Sounds similar to the Holy Land Foundation that used to operate right here in the United States. You started earlier by mentioning the I guess the board members, that they have working, from the Israeli military. I just was looking at some of the names. Major General Doron Almog, who avoided arrest in London in 2005 on suspicion of war crimes. Then you have Lieutenant Colonel Mike Hartman, head of the marksmanship and sharpshooter section in the IDF. You also have Shpatai Shavit, head of the Mossad, or former head of the Mossad. Isn't this a brazen coordinated enterprise between Israel's military and HESEG at the expense of freely Canadian citizens?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously brazen. I would say the Reisman and Schwartz understand they're taking advantage of Canadian charity law, tax law, to mobilize a subsidy for their donations. They are people who they helped set up the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. So previously there was the Canadian Jewish Congress and the Canada-Israel Committee, and the Canadian Jewish Congress was a very, pro-Zionist, but at least had sort of like a nominal kind of democratic structure, and nominally was about like fighting for, defending Jewish interests within Canada. And they basically got that all kiboshed, Rice and Schwartz, a couple other wealthy donor families, and set up the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, which doesn't even have Canada in its name, right? It has Israel in its name, and it's basically just designed to bring like Canadian Jewry and Israel is sort of like all one and the same. And because they are such ardent Zionists, they know that politically that helps Israel's cause. And so there are people who are deeply committed to, a colonial, anti-Palestinian, and current case genocidal politics, and they understand that the lone soldiers serve a useful interest for the IDF, for the Israeli military in terms of pressuring Israelis and sort of deepening commitment to the military force within Israel, and they sort of merge this mix of using Canadian tax law and the fact they have huge amounts of wealth and brought this together with the military structure within Israel, and it's just like completely. I mean, it would be outrageous if they were doing this just for their own money. I mean, in and of itself, the fact that they're Canadians using their money for this purpose, but the fact that they've been able to, for 15 plus years, have Canadian taxpayers subsidize this whole endeavor is just absolutely outrageous. And now when people challenge this and they put up some posters, they are able to get the Toronto police. The whole apartheid lobby structure frames it as an anti-Semitic act because the woman's Jewish, and they're able to get the Toronto police to bust into houses in the middle of the night in a coordinated. So this is as if it's some huge criminal network that were involved in murders or some affair, and they're able to bust in the middle of the night and target activists. So it's a pretty stunning example of the abuse of in this case the charitable structure, as well as the media and policing system on behalf of violence against Palestinians.
In your piece, you describe the immediate aftermath of the poster installations as follows. Those promoting Israel's genocide in Gaza panicked. Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center CEO Michael Levitt posted, and I'm quoting here, an absolutely appalling anti-Semitic attack in downtown Toronto, targeting Chapters Indigo and Jewish CEO Heather Reisman. While the media largely echoed Levitt's perspective, a few outlets at least offered the context on why Reisman was targeted. Anti-Semitism has become the knee-jerk reaction to any and everything that is critical of Israel or Zionists. Are people in Canada taking pause to examine the legitimacy of these blanket accusations?
Oh, I think people are catching on to the scam. There's no doubt about that. I mean, yesterday in Ottawa, you had maybe the biggest Palestine solidarity demonstration in Canadian history. There was a march on Ottawa, certainly the biggest Palestine demonstration in Ottawa's history. People are saying, I didn't go, I was unable to go, but people are saying 100,000, upwards of 100,000. I've seen the images. It's massive, massive demonstration. Buses came from Windsor, which is 8 or 9 hours away. This was a really impressive march on Parliament. And to be honest with you, after 6 weeks of, there's been here in Montreal, there's every weekend there's a major demonstration. Yesterday there was one here. There was 5,000, even though many people went to Ottawa. They've been up to 50,000 plus here in Montreal, and there's been actions like sort of almost every day for the past 6 weeks. To be honest with you, I was like, I don't know if people are going to have the energy, the time, and all this to make this a success in Ottawa. I was a little bit doubtful when I heard about it, but it clearly was not just a success; it was an overwhelming success. So you have two things happening. You have this like the media on this like over the top, and I should say that the Globe and Mail, the national paper, the most influential paper in the country, had this arrest on the front page of these activists. They're on the front page, and they didn't even mention that Heather Reisman has the HESEG. She set up the HESEG Foundation, right? So they just framed it as this hate. Hate is increasing in the country. So the fact that the media can be an overdrive with this anti-Semitism kind of smearing of all Palestine solidarity, yet it's not really deterring. I mean, I think it is succeeding at some level, right? It does deter some people. But you're still having the biggest demonstration, not just about Palestine, but certainly the biggest anti-war demonstration since 2003 in Canada, and the biggest internationalist demonstrations. And even in 2003, if you look back at the pre-Iraq war protests here in Montreal, you had these massive demonstrations, but those were taking place once a month, right? This was like we had two really really big ones here in Montreal that were like 100,000 plus, but there was a month gap between them. In this case, they're happening every week, every weekend, and then there's a whole bunch of actions happening during the week as well. So that level of commitment and mobilization, this is absolutely unprecedented, at least 20 years. Nothing like this is seen in Canada. So yes, they still have an effect, the smearing of anti-Semitism. I mean, they even called the Prime Minister, the former Canadian ambassador to Israel, she called the Prime Minister an anti-Semite, explicit, straight. This is an anti-Semite. He's always been anti-Semite because he basically said that babies being killed is not a good thing. I mean, the truth is that Trudeau has completely enabled Israel's genocide in Gaza. And then finally, when the protests are starting to break down a little bit of that, at least the staunch rhetorical support, and he makes a small comment about calling on Israel to hold back on killing civilians, and then they even call the Prime Minister an anti-Semite. So it's sort of happening at kind of both levels. Yes, it is effective. It is still deterring people. It does intimidate people, but simultaneously we're seeing these protests and the ability of I think particularly with age. Right, you see what happened at McGill University. McGill University just passed a resolution, 79%, biggest turnout in the history of the student union's referendums. 79% voted in favor of this opposition to genocide policy that's quite strong, has quite strong language about the university breaking relations with corporations and other entities complicit in Israeli apartheid. So certainly with the younger generation, the Zionist lobby has completely lost control of the narrative. That is absolutely clear. They're not buying into the smears. So it's quite a fascinating dynamic to see play out.
It sounds like there is a parallel between Canada and the United States amongst youth, because recent polls right here in the U.S. have shown that there is a movement amongst youth, pro-Palestinian movement, and now people, especially on college campuses, and we're witnessing a similar thing happening in Canada. This interview wouldn't be complete because I got actually to know you, not personally, but to see your videos publicly shaming some of the politicians in Canada. And I want to ask you about shaming important people, let's say, to hold them accountable. It seems very effective. Talk about that a bit, and one incident you think worked particularly well.
Yeah, so I've been doing this for a few years. We actually had a network called Disruption Network Canada of people across the country. And basically the idea is you find out where powerful people, predominantly ministers within the government, are holding press conferences or events and show up and just start criticizing their policy. And there's different dimensions to it in that if there's a lot of other, corporate media there, you're partly trying to get them to cover criticism of the government's policy. But then there's also a social media side to it, and the fact that, you can put it on Twitter, put it on Facebook, Instagram, wherever, and it gets wide circulation. So I did what I did of the Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly recently, where I found where she was, and I told her that she had blood on her hands, and that at that point 4,000 Palestinian children had been killed, and she just walks away and walks up the stairs, and 2 flights of stairs. It's real, like she let this look of real shame, and I got it quite well on my phone, and then I did actually said it in French. I said it in English, and then I said it in French to her because it's here in Montreal. And that that got lots of social media, and I think from the social media standpoint, it's about you're not really convincing people of a new idea per se, but you're sort of hoping to stoke a bit of like sense of resistance, and we need to mobilize, and we got hold the politicians accountable like that. That also got picked up widely on media, like Turkish media and some Arab media. I heard it was on the front page of an Algerian newspaper and stuff like that. Within Canada, the corporate media, dominant media, mostly ignores them, though not always. There was one in Vancouver of Trudeau. Some activists about 2 weeks ago got in a restaurant where Trudeau was eating, and they got right next to him, and we're saying that blood on his hands, ceasefire, and that was actually that was a top news item on the CBC, the national, on the big national TV news program. So these the social media has enabled this. The fact that we all have videos on our phones or whatever has enabled this, and it can be quite a powerful political effect, and clearly, there's no doubt that the Canadian government ministers have been totally troubled. Their ability to hold fundraisers in Vancouver, they disrupted a fundraiser, and I heard that the foreign minister didn't even end up showing because of it. And so these things can be very effective. It's just one tool in the broader. Obviously, you got the mass mobilizations, you got the media structure that we need to build. We got the all the different other kind of parts of it. But one form is directly challenging the ministers, but also I've also targeted some of the main figures in the apartheid lobby in Canada. Some of the big the top donor for Justin Trudeau, Stephen Bronfman, a few months back. I found out he was speaking at an event here in Montreal, and condemned him on his support for apartheid. So that can also be effective at not just with regards to the ministers or the prime minister, but other sort of figures.
Well, I think it's very effective because I've seen these videos, and I'm in San Francisco, so that gives you an idea. And perhaps, as you've mentioned, especially amongst young people, the social media, they're not going to be reading legacy newspapers and so forth. Probably it's doing an effective job against the billions of dollars that Heather Reisman and her husband Jerry Schwartz can spend on, and with just following you on Twitter and other social media sites. To read Yves Engler's updates and access his impressive resources, visit his website, yvesengler.com. You can order his books there as well. His latest is Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. Yves, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thanks for having me.
That's the voice and the face of Yves Engler, talking about how Heather Reisman and her billionaire husband, Gary Schwartz, established and are directors of the registered Canadian charity HESEG Foundation for Lone Soldiers. Jamal, this is really one of the most outrageous, craziest stories I've ever heard. You have a tax-deductible charity in Canada and throughout the world, in the United States and in Europe, basically raising money and sending non-Israeli citizens of other countries to fight and suppress in the apartheid state, committing war crimes. These are war crimes that are being committed, and they're getting tax deductions for sending these soldiers over there. It's an unbelievable story, Jamal.
Well, it's very believable because Israel gets away with everything, including murder. So that's the scenario.
But where's the accountability? What is the accountability of this, and in terms of confronting the Canadian government and the Canadian version of the IRS, who give these these charities tax-free opportunities and licenses to do this stuff in Canada?
Well, it's not only. I mean, it's not only this. It's not just about tax deduction, but also that they operate in violating basically Canadian laws, not just about taxation. They violate Canada's Foreign Enlistment Act, meaning as a Canadian to go and enlist in another military. So it's not
Army.
just like about that, but they, obviously he and others have raised this issue, and we'll see what's going to happen.
Well, we're going to follow this story, Jamal. It's so important. We're going to try to uncover and see if we can find out where in the United States and Europe they're doing this. But we should talk about a little bit about the exchange of hostages right now. We're going into day 3. Hamas has lived up to its side of the bargain by releasing the hostages that it said it would. Of course, the Israeli government and military is trying to pull a fast one, even though they agreed to it. They didn't allow the aid trucks into the northern part of Gaza, where it's needed the most. And yesterday, Hamas decided to put a stop or a hold on the release of the hostages until more aid could be, sent in to the northern part. It's a typical Israeli maneuver, Jamal.
Yes, and of course, more than this is that every single Palestinian hostage or prisoner, whatever term you want to use, but they are actually hostages because many of them are children. They were taken and they were kidnapped children.
Right.
They were subjected to humiliation and deprived of food, etc. when they came. And of course, they talked about their conditions, but I'm talking about the time during that transfer, to transfer them into the West Bank. And that's what I was actually observing and watching on different channels from the Middle East. And then we saw the picture of the Israeli hostages. They're waving to their captors. I don't know, but I don't want to comment too much about that, but they seem to be healthy to kind of corroborate what one earlier hostage who was released said, that they were treated well. Because, that just to counteract that propaganda that Israel puts out there, that it's terrible and they're treated poorly. When you compare that to some of those Palestinian prisoners, some of them who went to jail at the early age of 12 or 14 or 16, and they've been there for several years on allegations of throwing a stone or having a knife, and now they've been released. And Israel not only mistreated them during the transfer, but they prevented their families, at least the ones in East Jerusalem, from celebrating receiving them.
Right. Well, Jamal, it's kind of interesting when you think about it. The Palestinian political prisoner issue has been around forever, for decades and decades. It has touched the lives of every single Palestinian. living in Gaza, West Bank, or Jerusalem. And the release of these prisoners, at this time, only women and children, is truly an amazing kind of accomplishment if you think about it, right? These are people who have been treated under what the international community considers grave violations of international law, not having access to attorneys, being denied visits with family members, being subjected to torture, all of these things. And so their being released is a big, big issue. Having said that, there are still thousands and thousands of Palestinian prisoners who languish in Israeli prisons. And let's not forget, Jamal, there are probably 2.3 billion Palestinian political prisoners living in Gaza right now. And their fate is especially, devastating and catastrophic right now.
The other interesting thing that I want to mention about this before moving on to our next story is the fact that many of the Western journalists had a double standard in providing coverage for the Palestinian children who were released and women, because they're mostly children and women. In fact, many of them didn't know that Israel had so many Palestinian children and women, because I was like watching, they were like surprised. Oh, this bus is full. Where did these people come from? What were their charges? And this highlights this story because they have never received any coverage. Usually just like whatever Israel puts out there, but that the fact that you have this many Palestinian children behind bars in Israel, and that many of them are held without trial, without being provided with an attorney, for periods of time, like a year, 2 years, they're just like waiting for trial in a military court, basically.
Well, that's exactly right, Jamal. And I think, we don't have time to talk about it today, but the double standard of the reporting, what you see is on the mainstream media are all these, reunions of Israeli hostages with their families. But did you see anything on CNN or CBS or NBC or ABC about the reunions with Palestinian prisoners and their families? I didn't see any. Did I miss something? I saw it on Arab media, but I didn't see it on the mainstream media.
Very little, and it didn't provide context to it. Like they actually were B-rolling some of the footage that they were capturing from Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya, and were actually there. They're telling you each one's story. This is so and so. Her name is so and so. They went to jail when they were 14 years old. They don't tell you anything. They just like, they're celebrating and so forth. Moving on to the next story, Jess, and this is a big story because eyewitnesses to the October 7th hostage standoff in Kibbutz Be'eri, this is at least one incident here, have exposed Israel for misleading the world about the killing of a 12-year-old, which was who was cited by President Biden about, and others saying they saw children burned, and in fact, and misleading the entire world, because now in Israeli media, including Haaretz, and that's again, that was Israel's desperate bid for international sympathy to stir outrage over the killing of a 12-year-old girl. And now we're finding out, and that's based on several eyewitness reports, that the reason the house where that the girl was killed and she was burned because of Israel's so-called friendly fire. That came basically as the Israeli military was storming the kibbutz, and they were using tanks and helicopters targeting that particular house.
That's right, Jamal. And it looks like, based on the reporting of Haaretz, that some of the casualties, the gruesome casualties that were cited by Joe Biden and the Western media, were actually killed by Israeli fire. This is a big story.
Yeah,
have you seen it in the New York Times yet?
Early on, there was a survivor. Her name is Yasmin Porat, who was among the Israelis taken hostage by Hamas, and then she was let go, and then she gave an interview. She gave an interview as on November 15th. So we're talking about 40. How many days? I mean, talk about the standoff. Talk about December 15th.
Right.
Talking about the standoff and describing that she witnessed basically the Israelis were shooting at them and killing many Israelis in the kibbutz. And then
Jamal, so
then Israel,
what is
Haaretz reported it, and they received the lashing from Bibi Netanyahu, basically, and other people in his cabinet calling to shut down the newspaper.
So what's going to happen now? This is going to continue to be a story. It hasn't been picked up in the Western media yet. It hasn't been picked up anywhere, as far as I could tell. I haven't seen it in the New York Times. I haven't seen it on broadcast media. This is a big story because I think it's important. The war was prosecuted. This kind of genocide against Palestinians was prosecuted by these images and these ideas of these, quote, children being burned, when in fact it looks like the main image of that came from Israeli fire shooting their own citizens.
Absolutely right. There are many stories we want to talk about, but we're kind of running out of time, and I wanted to move on to Mr. Selwitz.
Stuart Selwitz, Jamal, who is a top official in the Obama administration. His portfolio included the Middle East and Palestine-Israeli affairs. He's been working under more than just the Obama. He was in the Bush administration too, I believe. He's a top senior national security advisor. And it seems like Mr. Selwitz is really pretty disturbed, Jamal, because he went after a halal cart vendor in New York, not just once, not just twice, but 3 times, and all caught on video, all screaming incredibly racist, Islamophobic, hateful comments, even saying that he was going to come after his family and new people. It was absolutely crazy, Jamal. But this is the world
I want
we
to
live in.
quote one of his worst quotes, which he said, if we killed, we, meaning we, so he's now associating himself with Israel, okay? If we killed 4,000 Palestinian kids, it wasn't enough. And he repeats it again, it wasn't enough. I mean, this is how disturbed this guy is. But imagine why we're talking about him, because there are other hate mongers, there are many other Islamophobes. This guy held a very important position in the Obama administration at the State Department. And the big question that we like to pose is how many Selwitzes are there now? Imagine, because this guy, I mean, how many of them carry or hold these hateful sentiments and
Lots.
and anti-Muslim, anti-Arab sentiments? And this guy was in a very, very important position. He wasn't like some pencil, whatever, pusher.
No, Jamal, this guy had a top security clearance. He was advising the State Department and the White House on how to negotiate and how to engage politically in Palestine. And I think your question is a good one. How many Selwitzes are there in the State Department? Quite a few. But this is also juxtaposed against the fact that 500 members of the State Department signed a letter to Antony Blinken condemning the U.S. State Department and the U.S. policy against Palestinians. So we seem to have quite a split in the State Department, as there is in the U.S. government, as there is globally right now, between what is happening in Palestine and what leaders are doing to support the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza.
And going against the grain, against what we're seeing, my last comment is the demonstrations right here in the United States and globally, pro-Palestinian, anti-genocide, basically. And then you have people like him running around, and it gives you an idea why the governments are basically out of touch with the people. And that's a representation. I mean, if you have 10 more like him, God help us.
Well, yeah. And before we end, Jamal, I can't believe I'm going to say what I'm going to say, but this is probably the only time that I've agreed with what Fox News has said about Joe Biden. You know, Fox News has been critical of Joe Biden, of course, for years and years and years. But recently, they labeled Joe Biden and they gave him a name. Do you know what that name was?
What is it?
Genocide Joe. So
that's coming from Fox News.
This is coming from Fox News. So I will say this, it's probably the only time I agree with Fox News, but I'm referring to Joe Biden as Genocide Joe, because we have to keep reminding our listeners and viewers that the genocide in Gaza against Palestinian men, women, and children could only be carried out with the full blessing of Joe Biden and the U.S. administration. So we'll be talking about that as time goes on and we get close to the elections.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll speak to you next week.
We'll see you next week.